The context for this story is one of searching, of lostness, of anxiety, of despair. It begins with an unplanned pregnancy, with what another generation called an unwed mother. Mary is pregnant. She's not yet married to Joseph, and this lightning bolt that lands within their relationship. Scripture is so succinct sometimes, so much beauty or wonder, or in this case, pain, can be contained in such a short sentence. Consider the sentence, Joseph resolved to put away Mary quietly. In other words, he resolved to dump her without making a fuss about it. He was carrying this heartbreak that he believed that the one whom he loved had betrayed him. And Mary is also carrying heartbreak because the one whom she loves doesn't believe her, doesn't believe that she has not betrayed him at all, but rather she said yes to God. And Joseph would have gone through with this painful putting aside, except he's warned in a dream by an angel not to do so. And he doesn't go through with it. And so their marriage continues. This is a story of anxiety as well and of pain because it is a story that takes place under the boot of empire, under occupation. Mary and Joseph are a part of an occupied people. As they walk through their land, they see another nation's soldiers walking on the streets, and always on the hills are the crosses, these symbols of empire's domination, its humiliation, its torture, its subjugation. There's the continual fear that the cross will be turned upon them and upon their friends. I heard an academic interviewed recently whose field of study is people who live within war, civilians and children in particular, who live within war. And he spoke of his deep frustration. That's probably not a strong enough word. When people speak of civilians and children who live within war and use the language of post-traumatic stress disorder, he said he doesn't like this language because there's nothing post about what is going on for the civilians who live underneath the bombers. This is ongoing. Post is what happens after the car crash, after the diagnosis, after the robbery. It's not while the explosions are still happening. And this is the reality for Mary and Joseph. The violence is still there, and the fear of violence is still there every day. It's a scene of anxiety and hardship because it's a context of poverty. Joseph and Mary are not rich. People who speak ancient Greek tell us that the word that we often render as carpenter, Joseph's gig, and then later on Jesus' gig, could as well or better be rendered in English as day laborer. These are not people with status, and we find that when empire pushes them out, a decree went out that everyone should be registered. They have to go to Joseph's hometown, and there's no room for them in the inn. There's always room for you in the inn when you have money. And then all of this anxiety and sadness, all of this despair and fear culminates in the intensity of childbirth. This most, well, I'm just repeating the same word, this most intense of human experiences, particularly in the ancient Near East before contemporary medicine. Childbirth is far more dangerous than it is right now. When our 3 children were born at each of their births, I was struck, and forgive me if this is a macabre thought, I don't mean it to be, I was struck how similar it was being present for a birth as it was to being present when someone dies. In both birth and in death, it becomes inescapable that we are animals. And there is a point in birth and death alike where what is going to happen will happen. There's nothing you can do to stop it. So all of these things, all of this anxiety, intensity, fear, in some cases despair, all of this worry, this is where God shows up. Richard Rohr, the contemporary theologian and mystic, says God always goes towards the pain. And we see this throughout Jesus' ministry. We see it throughout his life. He is always going towards people who need healing, people who need feeding, people who need to have their demons cast out. And at the beginning of his life, we see this as well. He shows up to this poor and hurting and searching family. In the ancient Near East, it wasn't a weird idea that God could become a human being. That was part of the mythos of that culture. But what is weird is that God is becoming a human being in this context, in this occupied, poor, fearful, on-the-road family. You would expect God to show up in the palace. You would expect God to show up in this place of wealth and status. And that is not where God shows up. God shows up in this lowly stable. His crib famously is a manger. It's a trough. They can't afford a crib. And because Scripture always has more than one layer, the manger, the trough, manger being French to eat, prefigures all of the people whom Jesus will feed and how he will feed them with his own body. God is going towards the pain. When I first came to church some 20 years ago, I showed up with a longing for something. And maybe you're here tonight with your own longing. I had this longing that this story that we're telling tonight, the story of Emmanuel, God with us, this longing that in spite of everything, this story might be true. We live after the Enlightenment. We live in this hyper-intellectual, scientific, measurable age, and yet something drew me here, drew me to a place like this one in the hopes that I might meet God incarnate and that church, of all places, might help me do it. I was pretty skeptical of the idea that church could help. I knew church mostly via Jimmy Swaggart, who was on do you all remember him? Who was, I guess he's still alive, right? Who was on the TV of my childhood. He was on right before my favorite cartoon, Rocket Robin Hood. And Swaggart was the standard bearer for Christianity. He taught me that Christianity was anti-intellectual and judgmental and super concerned with who was in and who was out and variously obsessed with and terrified of sex. Church was the last place that I would go looking to answer this longing, and yet somehow I showed up anyway, and I'm grateful that I did. As I've sat with faith, as I've done the wrestling with faith, Israel is a word that means the one who wrestles with God. I have come to believe that faith is this longing that the story might be true, this longing that God might be with us. We often think of faith as being some kind of, again, here we are in this intellectual place, intellectual assent to a series of precepts. But I don't think that's what faith is at all. I think faith is that longing for God. David Brooks wrote about this recently in the New York Times. It's a marvelous article. And reflecting on what Brooks has said and what other theologians have said, I want to suggest that understanding faith as longing for God is liberative. It allows for this expansive understanding of what faith might be. Because it means that when someone says, I wish I could believe, that is an expression of holy longing of faith. When someone says, as I heard someone say just recently, I don't think there's a heaven, but I hope I'm wrong, that hope is an expression of that holy longing of faith. When we show up at a place like this, in spite of the deep flaws of the institution that is the church, looking for Jesus, that is an expression of that holy longing of faith. At our annual Christmas concert a few days ago, 2 days ago, I had the same confusion at the earlier service, so it really was only 2 days ago. We read a number of poems, and one of the poems we read was by Madeleine L'Engle. Many of you will know L'Engle is the author of A Wrinkle in Time. That's probably what she's most famous for, but she wrote a lot of stuff, including a poem called Into the Darkest Hour, and I'd like to read it again now. Throughout the poem, L'Engle keeps repeating the observation, the claim, the understanding of the incarnation. And she says of it over and over, it was a time like this. It was a time like this. War and tumult of war, a horror in the air, hungry yawned the abyss, and yet there came the star and the child, most wonderfully there. It was a time like this, of fear and lust for power, license and greed and blight, and yet the Prince of Peace came into the darkest hour in quiet and silent light. And in a time like this, how celebrate his birth when all things fall apart? Ah, wonderful it is. With no room on the earth, the stable is our heart. We might say the creation of that stable in our hearts is created through our longing for God, through our faith. It was a time like this. This is a moment, I think, for a lot of folks that is a time of anxiety, of searching, of fear, of despair. And the story says God goes towards the pain. God is coming towards us. God is with us. So let's long together for this story. What if this story just might be true? What if together we can help make it true? What if together, through our holy longing, through our faith, we can create that manger in our hearts and invite God once more to become Emmanuel, God with us. Merry Christmas.